You and I just met, so this is our first date. Everybody gets to see us engaged.
We had an almost date before, because I was in the audience when you were in London with Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins, and
That's right.
Sam asked me as a guest, and I was there in the audience. So
And Sam didn't bother to introduce us at all at that, or we
we would have been able to do this before.
could have been fast friends longer than this. But we had a brief discussion about labels, about how do I, is this the British neoconservative intellectual talking head proponent of a think tank who's has his thoughts on Islam and immigration and all this, and you know, is an author of 4 books, soon to be 5, I think.
Yeah.
And that led to some concern about labels that I think we share in many areas.
By the way, in Britain, if you introduce somebody as an intellectual, it's death. Nothing that kills something more.
I have no fear of being introduced like that anywhere.
Yeah, no, I am concerned about labels these days because we were talking before about the nature of the internet and that nobody expected it to go this way of like, unbelievable vitriol and rage and sort of grasping for short-term explanations for people. And yeah, political labels and indeed some religious labels become really unhelpful because they become a sort of way to not listen to somebody in advance. You know, some of it can be useful, obviously, but by this stage, I kind of feel most political labels are a real problem.
I wonder how much of it is maybe. I don't necessarily want to label people as excessively lazy or frustrated, but I think that has to be a part of it where everything is a label. Every word we use is a label for some concept, and so we use this to communicate, and we're generally pretty good at it in the sense that we're not falling apart at the roots of civilization. We're able to, you understand me, I understand you, even though I don't have that particular accent. We've sorted it out a little bit. But when we talk about the labels that we put on broader concepts, what I find happens quite often is they're either used as a way to dismiss without any actual substantive conversation, or they're used as a shorthand where you just assume the people you're talking to have the same understanding of the label that you do.
Right.
And that's not necessarily the case.
No, and I don't want to labor the point, but transatlantic, it's not a consistent language about politics. Where I'm from, liberal means something different from what it means here, for instance. And there's all sorts of words like that don't travel. But no, I mean, I think that generally the problem of labels has been accentuated by social media, which has all sorts of advantages, has some serious drawbacks. And the main drawback, I mentioned this to Matt earlier, is that people who do the sort of things we do used to craft what we said and what we wrote in order to make sure, among other things, that an honest critic couldn't misunderstand us. And the strange thing about the era of social media and the internet is that you end up having to craft what you say and write in order to try to make sure that a dishonest critic also can't misrepresent you. It's an almost impossible task, but one we're obviously trying to find our way through.
It's when it comes to the sorting out which are the honest critics and which are the dishonest critics, I find that's actually getting more difficult as well, because while I pretend to read minds on stage, I can't actually read minds, and so if somebody comes after something I've said on Twitter or Facebook or whatever, I have to spend a great deal of time before I even decide if I'm going to respond or how I'm going to respond. Is this individual confused? Have I not crafted my message clearly enough? Or is there some way I could reword the message to rehabilitate this individual? Or are they one of the dishonest ones, the people who are sometimes labeled the outrage brigade by my friend Seth? They're just never going to be happy no matter what you say, because you didn't say it exactly the way they wanted to in the time frame they wanted.
Yeah, what I get is you didn't say it all in the 60 seconds we gave you, which, if you're dealing with the meaning of life or something, it's often hard to hit that moment.
Yes. in the debates that I've often had with religious apologists, there's something called the Gish Gallop, which is named after Duane Gish, where the apologist will present 20 things that are wrong,
Right.
each of which would take you an hour to 10 hours to properly rebut.
Yes.
And then whichever ones you don't address, when it's their turn to speak next, they'll say, my opponent failed to address points 3, 4, 7, and therefore I win.
Yeah. Well, the Times of London the other day reported on this Flat Earth Society that's now booming, at least booming to the extent that Flat Earth Societies can for the time being. But I mean, they had I don't know, they had a conference the other day in London, and they got like 300 flat earthers who all had these points about like the horizon, no one had actually been to it. How do you know? And there was some amazing. Then they had T-shirts and things. You know, they obviously want people to know they're flat earthers and how dim they are. But you know, we weren't expecting that. We weren't expecting the Flat Earth Society to get a boom in the foreseeable future, and yet there they are.
I can remember years ago, and I don't know how many people here have watched a lot of episodes of the Atheist Experience, but there was an episode where I basically said, well, nobody believes in the Greek gods anymore. And that was a mistake because the emails came in. It didn't come pouring in, they trickled in, but it was still...
What did they
people,
say?
They said, oh, you're wrong. I actually still do believe in the Greek gods. And I was like, oh, that's a good joke. And then they were clearly offended and outraged that I would dismiss this as a joke. And so I had a brief conversation with one of them, and it's not worth repeating. But to be fair, it encouraged me to exercise more caution in making, grandiose claims of nobody believes this anymore. Oh, somebody does.
You sort of hope that they're in a terrible internecine war with people who still worship the Roman gods. You know, they just go at it late at night.
Yes. I've done much the same thing with Christian apologists on occasion. There was an event where I had done a video about slavery, and every Christian apologist has a different pathway to try to rehabilitate the Bible's position on slavery. And so I was standing there with 4 of them, and they were all trying to rehabilitate this in a different way.
Right.
And so it was perfect because I just said, you 4 sort it out. When you figure out what the right answer is from God, come back and I'll address that one. Because until you do, I don't see any reason to address 4 different answers from God. Why hasn't he cleared this up already?
Yeah. Were there any plausible arguments from them?
I don't know. I never heard back from them after they... I suspect that there was not agreement.
At least they'd all agreed it was bad. And they were trying
You
to...
would hope so, but you would be mistaken.
Really?
Because there are people who go down that road that say that once upon a time it was perfectly moral and acceptable. And also that because ultimately it was in the benefit of those who were enslaved because they now had access to the true religion that they didn't have access to before.
Right. God, it's a hell of a way to get it, isn't it? It's the worst route there.
Yeah, salvation at gunpoint, I
Yeah.
guess, kind of. There's one question that I was asked to ask you, so I might get that out of the way because it might tie into a few things. An internet friend of mine wanted me to ask why you encouraged atheists in Great Britain to go to church last Christmas.
Good question. We go straight into the deeps. Well, obviously Britain, where I'm from, and Europe more generally, the situation with religion is different from the situation you have here. I mean, there are all sorts of differences, all sorts of similarities, but we don't have in Britain a kind of any form of strong Christianity that I see as being any threat in the public sphere. I mean, our bishops are all basically on the verge of atheism, as far as I can see. If you get a bishop in Britain, I mean, the hardest thing to do for them is to affirm what was their creed. You know, it's filled with sort of God, as it were. You know, so we have the sort of doubting bishop as a sort of perpetual part of the comedy of British life. And So we don't have that assertive form of religion which can still exist here, and in certain states is very strong. And I think it's partly, I write a bit about this quite a bit in this recent book. I think that we are in a very strange place in Europe, in Britain, in our relation to faith. And for all sorts of reasons, of which we can get into, we are in this situation that a wonderful French philosopher called Chantal del Sol described as being in the situation that Icarus would have been in if he'd survived the fall. That is, that by the time that the Cold War finishes in Europe, we've dreamed all of these religious dreams and they've all crashed. We've dreamed all of these political dreams, including two big ones in the 20th century that turned out to be global nightmares. So that by the time the last of those falls, we are on the ground, wounded, burnt, singed, badly bruised, and rather amazed to find that we're still here, with this big question that then comes up, which is, what do we do? And again, I mean, this doesn't apply in quite the same way in this country as I see it.
Which I think may be one of the reasons why this kind of question goes up, but I want to let you get through it.
But I suppose one of the things I feel, and I know a lot of people now in Europe from the political left, right, center ground, atheists, non-atheists, and so on, who are starting to worry. And I suppose the worry, for me, condenses into this, which is the increasing fear that the Enlightenment didn't go very deep or very wide or very far, and that it turns out not to be cherished by all that many people, and that what might come down the road might be so much worse. I put it no stronger for now than the nervousness. And since this is a situation we're in, I mean, I'm an atheist, I have been for many years. I don't believe in the little claims of the Bible or anything else. But I do recognize something which in Europe, at any rate, I see and I'm concerned about, which is what I regard as a vacuum. And one of the only interim answers I've been able to put forward is to say, we can accept the fact that we're atheists, we can accept the fact that we don't believe in literal truth and so on, and yet have to find a way to remind ourselves and each other of how we got to where we are. Because there's a whole set of things which I and others start to worry about. And one of the few ways I've found to try to explain this is to say that includes in engaging in parts of your past which you no longer believe in, at the very least to know how you got to where you are now. So I didn't say in that piece that people should go to church and praise the risen Lord, but to say to them, at least engage in the thing that got you to the place you are now, and know how it happened. Let me put it another way very quickly. One of the most striking things, there's a British rabbi called Jonathan Sacks, who has some position here in New York as well. Some years ago I said to him, a slightly impertinent question, but I said, Rabbi Sacks, I know quite a lot of your congregation in London, and how can I put this, but they all seem to be atheists, or at least a lot of them. And without missing a beat, he said, oh, most of them, I'd have thought. And I said, and you could see I was sort of slightly thrown, and I said, well, what do you take from that? And he replied rabbinically with a non-answer. He said, this year 98% of British Jews will be celebrating the holidays. And this is just an interesting way through a bit of this, it seems to me. Accepting the realities of where we are, but not casting people into, particularly the people you and I both know and have come across, who find the position, once they arrive there, of atheism to be a very lonely place. And I just, as I say, it's not an answer to the whole thing, but as an interim thing, to say at least remain engaged in all of this idea and all of this past, engage with it.
I think I might understand what some of the confusion and concern is, and I suspected some of this is differences on either side of the pond. And for me, not having grown up in Britain, suffocated by Church of England, and its largely atheistic irrelevancy. I find it strange that you're talking to a rabbi who says that 98% of Jews are going to be celebrating the holidays. I'm assuming he's talking about Christmas.
Oh, no, he's talking about the Jewish
He's
holidays.
talking about the Jewish holidays. And yet, we know that studies have shown that 50% of Jews in Israel are secular.
Sure.
And Reform Judaism doesn't require any belief in God. So
Sure.
we often make a mistake of talking about religion as if it's one thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's absolutely false, because Judaism, even in its varieties, is already very different. The Reform Judaism doesn't require a belief in a God, and so you get a rabbi that's not surprised that his congregation is largely atheist, and then you get conservative and Hasidic Jews that I doubt very many of those are atheists, and then you have the various varieties of Christianity, and one of the questions that's come up quite often is, why is the view of religion in the UK so much different from the way it is in the States? And I've often heard it put forward that this is an issue of a free market, where in the UK, because you have a state religion, there was no competition to draw people in, and the United States, we had freedom of religion, and so they're in competition to market.
Yes, I mean, let me give an example of that. Everybody in the UK lives technically in a parish, and that means that the priest in that parish could, even if you were a non-believer, be responsible for your spiritual well-being, for your funeral, for instance. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that everyone automatically gets a Church of England funeral, but it means that the default position is that the state church would be there. Whereas I think if you were a Catholic, for instance, if you were an atheist and you died, your local Catholic church would not stake any claim for your religious rights. So there is yes, it has done something strange like that. The other thing is just that, who knows, it's just a lot more advanced in Europe, for good and ill, but that they say that, well, the southern Mediterranean states, Italy, Catholic Church is very strong still, Spain, very strong. So, you have to draw up these distinctions within it. But basically in the Protestant parts of Europe, there's very little. They some time ago, I think, became basically the Green Party at prayer.